Wyoming Territory, spring of 1882, the wind was sharp and dry as gunpowder when Georgia Fallow stumbled into the edge of the canyon. Her boots dust-caked, her cheeks tear-streaked, and her baby pressed close against her chest. She had been walking for hours, maybe longer. Time had gone soft around the edges since the fire, since the screaming, since the cabin she had called home for almost 2 years burned to the ground with her husband's bitterness still echoing in her ears. Her arms trembled as she adjusted the baby's weight. Little Olive was light, barely 6 months old, but George's body was worn raw with exhaustion. Her bonnet hung crooked, casting a narrow line of shade across her freckled face, and her brown hair clung to her damp neck. She had no plan, only a direction: west. Away from the life she had tried to build with a man who had never truly wanted her. She had not cried when he rode off for the last time 2 days ago. She had only packed what she could and left. The canyon opened wide below, and her breath caught not from fear, but from the sight of it. The land stretched in folds of red and gold, with scrub brush and cottonwoods gathered near the water that wound like a silver ribbon far below. Somewhere out there people lived, maybe better ones. A neigh cut through the silence, her head snapped up. A figure on horseback was coming down the trail to her right, steady and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. The horse was a deep-chested buckskin, and the man rode like he was born in the saddle, long legs, broad shoulders, his hat pulled low. George's breath caught again, but for a different reason. He reined in a few yards from her and dismounted in one smooth motion. He looked young, maybe 28, with dark blonde hair and a faint scar that ran from the corner of his eye down to his jaw. His face was sun-burnished, serious, and something in his gaze made her knees weaken. "You all right, miss?" he asked, voice low and steady. I do not know," she said, holding Olive closer. My baby and we need help, just for a while. Just until I can find work." His eyes dropped to the bundle in her arms. A slow breath left him like he had been holding it. He stepped closer, gaze never leaving hers. "May I?" She hesitated, then nodded. He reached out, careful and sure, and took the baby into his arms. Olive stirred, blinked up at him, then curled a tiny fist around the edge of his shirt. The man stared down at her like he knew her from somewhere far away. Then softly, barely above the wind, he whispered, "I have been waiting for both of you." George's heart stopped, then kicked hard against her ribs. "What?" He looked up at her, eyes full of something she could not name yet. "Come with me. My cabin's just over that ridge. There's food, a place to sleep. You will both be safe there." She should have questioned it, should have asked who he was, why he was out here alone, but Olive had relaxed in his arms, and Georgia felt something she had not felt in months, maybe years. A sliver of trust, a whisper of hope. "What is your name?" she asked. He shifted the baby gently to one arm and offered his hand. "Orin McCrae." "Georgia Fallow," she said, taking it. He held her hand a beat longer than needed. Then he led his horse by the reins as they walked, Georgia beside him, her skirts brushing the dry ground. The baby slept against Orin's chest. The sun dropped slow behind the ridge as they reached a small wooden cabin tucked into a grove of aspens. The porch sagged a little on one end, but everything about it said solid, lived in, safe. Inside, it was warm with the smell of cedar and old bread. A rifle leaned against the stone hearth, and a single cot sat near the wall. He set Olive down inside a woven cradle near the fire, his movements gentle. "I built that," he said. "My sister had a baby once. She never came back for her." Georgia looked at him, then at the cradle. "You raised a child." "No, he died that winter. Fever took him." She swallowed hard. "I am sorry." He nodded once, eyes on the flames. "You do not need to be sorry. Just stay, rest. You both look like you have not had a good night's sleep in weeks." She looked down at her hands. They were red and cracked. Her nails were split. She had not slept more than an hour at a time since the fire. "Just for tonight," she said. "You can have the bed," he said. "I will take the floor." That night, Georgia lay awake while Olive slept nearby, the fire casting flickering light on the logs. She listened to Orin's breathing from across the room, steady and low. She did not know what to make of him. A stranger who had taken her child in his arms like she belonged to him. Like he had been waiting. She did not understand it yet. But she did not feel afraid. The next morning, Orin cooked beans and cornbread. He did not ask questions. He only handed her a cup of coffee and nodded toward the chair. "You got folks out here?" he asked finally. "No. My parents died in Missouri. I married young, too young. He left 2 days ago, took the wagon and the mules. He said he was not meant to be a father." Orin's jaw worked, but he said nothing. "I will not stay long," she added. "I can clean so. I will find something." "You do not owe me anything," Orin said. She looked up. "Why did you say that? That you had been waiting for us?" He stared at her for a long beat. "Because it is true." Georgia stood slowly, walked over. She reached for Olive, who was still nestled in the cradle, then looked at Orin. "You can hold her again if you want." He did not answer with words. He just stepped over and took the baby into his arms like he had done it 1,000 times. Olive cooed softly. Georgia watched him, heart pounding. Orin looked at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw you in a dream once, both of you. I did not know when you would come, but I have been waiting." She did not laugh. She did not doubt him. She only moved closer, her fingers brushing Olive's cheek. "Maybe," she said, "we have been walking toward you all this time." Orin's eyes stayed on hers. "Then stay. Let this be home." Georgia's throat tightened. She wanted to say yes. She wanted the peace she saw in his eyes, the steadiness of his hand holding her child, but trust did not come easy. Still, she stayed one more night, and then another. The third morning came with a hush. Snow had fallen in the night, a late flurry that coated the trees in fine white lace and softened every sound. Georgia stood at the single-paned window, watching the wind lift small clouds of powder from the pine branches. Behind her, Olive stirred in her sleep. Orin had risen before dawn. She heard the door pull shut an hour earlier, and now the faint sound of an axe drifted from the tree line. He had said nothing when he left, only tucked an extra log on the fire and glanced toward the cradle with a quiet nod. Georgia had not asked to stay. Not aloud. But she hadn't packed her things either. The bundle of clothes she'd arrived with still sat beneath the cot, untouched. Her hands ached to be busy. So she pulled the coat Orin had hung by the door around her shoulders and stepped outside. The air bit at her cheeks, but the sky was clean and blue. She followed the sound until she found him near the woodpile, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the axe swinging in a clean rhythm. A neat stack of split logs grew beside him. He paused when he saw her. "Too cold for you out here. I needed to move." She stepped closer, boots crunching over the crusted snow. "I can help with kindling." He handed her a hatchet without a word. She took a seat on a stump and began splitting the smaller branches. Her fingers worked stiffly at first, but the motion steadied her mind. After a while, he asked without looking up, "You plan on going to town, eventually?" She focused on the blade, lining it with a knot in the wood. "I'll need to find work if I'm to keep food in Olive's mouth." "There's a ranch north of here," he said, "run by a widow named Bayard. She takes on help during lambing season." He paused. "You'd be safe there." Georgia glanced across at him. "And what about here?" He didn't answer right away. The axe came down once more, clean through. Then he rested it against the stump and looked at her, the snow bright in his hair. "You're not a burden, Georgia." She tightened her grip on the hatchet. "I didn't say I was. You don't have to." He stepped closer, voice quiet. But I can see it in the way you keep standing halfway out the door." She stood, brushing wood chips from her skirt. "You think I should stay?" "I think you already are." They stood there, not moving, not speaking. The wind shifted and a pine branch dropped snow between them with a soft thump. She didn't look away. "I don't know how to trust what feels good," she said. "That doesn't mean it's wrong." She let the hatchet fall into the pile. "I should check on Olive," he nodded. "I'll carry in the wood." Inside, the fire had burned low. Georgia added new kindling and breathed life into the coals. Olive stirred and began to fuss, fists waving. Georgia lifted her, settling into the rocking chair near the hearth, humming low to soothe her. Orin entered quietly, arms full of wood. He stacked it near the fire, then crouched to feed the flames. He didn't glance her way, but his presence filled the room. "You ever married?" she asked, surprising herself. "No." "Why not?" He leaned back on his heels. "Didn't find the right person. And I wasn't much to look at when I came out of the war." She waited. "Shrapnel tore through my side," he said, voice flat. "Took me near a year to walk right again." "Folks don't see you the same after something like that." Georgia looked at him fully now, at the faint stiffness in his movements, the way his left leg bore weight a little differently. "I do," she said, his eyes lifted to hers. "Do what?" "See you." He stood slowly, brushing his hands clean. "You can have the chair tonight. I don't need it, even so." That evening she cooked a bit of cornmeal mash with tallow and dried currants from his storage. It wasn't much, but Orin said, "Tastes better than I've eaten in months." After Olive drifted to sleep, Georgia stepped outside again. The snow had stopped, leaving a stillness so deep it felt like the world was holding breath. She didn't hear him come out, but suddenly he was beside her, arms folded, gaze on the horizon. "I thought I was done hoping," she said. He didn't respond. Just stood there, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I never wanted to run again," she added. "But when he left, it felt like something broke loose in me, like I couldn't keep pretending." "You're not pretending now." "No." She turned to him. "I don't know what this is. Or what it means." "I do," he said. He didn't reach for her, didn't press. He only met her eyes and waited, and somehow that was enough. Georgia let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. "I'll stay through the thaw." Orin nodded once. "Then I'll see to the roof tomorrow. It leaks in spring." They stood there until the cold pushed them back inside. The fire had burned high again, casting gold across the floorboards. Olive slept with her tiny mouth parted, one hand open beside her cheek. Georgia tucked the blanket around her, then turned toward Orin, who stood by the hearth watching. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. She only nodded, and he nodded back. By the end of the week, the snow had melted into the thirsty earth, leaving the cabin surrounded by patches of wet ground and the first green shoots of wild onion. A meadowlark sang from somewhere behind the woodshed, and the air smelled faintly of thawed pine and damp bark. Georgia stood barefoot on the porch, her skirt hiked above her ankles while she poured water from a basin, scrubbing the last of the soot from a borrowed flour sack. She had fashioned it into a makeshift diaper earlier that morning. Olive lay on a wool blanket beside the door, blinking at the sky with a solemn gaze that still startled Georgia with its quiet steadiness. Inside, Orin was sanding new hinges for the barn door. She could hear the rasp of it, steady and patient. He hadn't asked her to help, but she'd taken to doing what she could, hauling water, tending the fire, mending the sleeves of his worn shirts with thread she'd pulled from the hem of her own dress. That afternoon, when Olive finally drifted to sleep, Georgia stepped inside and leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You said you had a sister," she said. He didn't look up from the plank. "Her name was Lisa." "Where is she now?" "Buried in the cottonwood grove past the ridge." Georgia stepped farther into the room, her voice softer. "What happened?" She married a man who liked the sound of his own anger. He set the hinge down, slow and deliberate. By the time I got back from the war, she was gone. Neighbors said her boy didn't last long after. Georgia sat on the stool near the hearth. That cradle, it was for her son, he nodded. Built it with her standing right over me, telling me it needed to rock smoother. She looked down at her hands, the skin still rough in the creases. I used to think starting over meant forgetting everything behind me, but I can't forget any of it. Not the good or the bad. You're not supposed to, she met his eyes. Do you think a person can ever stop being afraid? I don't think fear's the problem, he said. It's what you do with it. Georgia rose, crossed the room, and picked up the shirt she'd been mending. I used to talk to Olive at night before she could even open her eyes. I told her stories, not about where we were, but where we might go. Orin reached for the shirt, fingers brushing hers. You still do. She let him take it. I don't know what kind of woman I am anymore. He folded the fabric once and set it on the table. You're the kind that keeps going. She stepped back, pressing a hand to her chest where the heat had settled. This isn't what I pictured. Not any of it. Me neither. Outside, the wind swept through the aspens, their branches whispering against one another. Georgia moved toward the cradle and checked Olive's blanket, smoothing it gently. You ever wonder why some people cross your path and stay, and others just pass through? I think about it most days. Olive stirred, her lips working in her sleep. Georgia didn't look up when she spoke again. I don't know how to love someone without bracing for the loss. You're doing it already, Orin said, stepping to her side. She turned, her voice barely above a breath. So are you. He reached out, not to touch her, but to steady the air between them. Then maybe we meet in the middle. Georgia held his gaze. What does that look like? He glanced toward the open door, where the light stretched long across the dirt. A fence line that needs mending. A roof that'll leak again next spring. A child growing tall enough to chase chickens. And two people who keep showing up. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she took his hand and placed it over Olive's small chest, where her heartbeat thrummed steady and strong. This is all I have, she whispered. He didn't pull away. It's all I've been waiting for. The first real warmth of April settled low in the valley, thickening the air with the scent of damp soil and pine. The creek near the foot of Orin's land had swelled with meltwater, and he'd rigged a line of stones across its shallows to make it easier for Georgia to fetch water while carrying Olive, who now watched the world with a quiet alertness that made Orin pause sometimes mid-step, as though the child saw more than she should. Georgia had taken to walking the edge of the pasture after breakfast, Olive bundled snug to her chest, her boots leaving soft impressions in the thawed ground. Orin didn't follow her, but he always watched from the barn roof where he'd begun replacing the shingles, silent as a hawk on a fence post. One afternoon, as she returned from the woods behind the ridge, Georgia found Orin kneeling in the yard, sleeves rolled, palms dusty, digging a narrow channel from the rain barrel toward the garden plot. He looked up when he heard her approach. Planning something? She asked. He brushed soil from his fingers. If you're staying through growing season, figured we could try beans and cabbage. Ground's soft enough now. She shifted Olive higher on her hip. You think we'll still be here come harvest? I do. She knelt beside him, close enough to smell the iron scent rising from the earth. You always this sure of things? No, he said. But I've learned to trust what holds. Georgia ran her hand over the dirt. I never planted anything before. Not for myself. You will now. She looked at him, and for the first time there was no hesitation behind her eyes. That night, after Olive had fallen asleep in the cradle, Georgia stood at the hearth, drying her hair with a strip of linen. She'd bathed in the basin by the firelight, and her skin was pink from the heat. Orin sat at the table, shaping a new handle for her sewing scissors, carving it from cherry wood with precise, quiet focus. "I didn't expect to feel calm again," she said, not looking up. "You don't have to rush it. I'm not rushing, I just—" She turned toward him, voice steadier than she expected. "I keep wondering if the piece will last." He set the carving knife down. "It will if we make it." She stepped closer, linen still in her hands. "And if I break it, then I'll be right here helping you mend it." She studied him. "You talk like someone who's already decided." "I have." She crossed the room and sat beside him. "I need to know you're not just filling the empty." "I'm not." "How do you know?" Orin tilted his head toward the cradle. "Because she's not mine, and I still look forward to every time she cries." Georgia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "She likes your voice. Calms faster when you say her name. She knows who's holding her." Georgia touched his arm, the first time she'd done so without hesitation. "So do I." They didn't speak for a while after that. The fire cracked low and the shadows on the walls shifted with the flames. Georgia leaned her head against his shoulder. Orin didn't move, didn't press, just let her rest there, quiet and close. Later, when the fire had burned down to embers and Georgia had fallen asleep in the chair by the hearth, Orin rose carefully and lifted her into his arms. She stirred only slightly, eyes fluttering open, then closed again as she felt the warmth of his chest. "You don't have to carry me," she murmured. "I know," he said, "but I want to." He laid her gently on the cot and covered her with the wool blanket. She didn't let go of his hand. Outside, the moon climbed high over the trees and the land settled into silence. Inside, 3 heartbeats pulsed in quiet rhythm, one small, one steady, one finally at rest. The days lengthened. By late May, the light lingered well past supper, and the sky turned the color of old tin before giving way to stars. Orin's land had taken on a softness fields brushed green, the garden rows rising in neat lines, and the hens clucking louder now that the earth had warmed. Georgia sat beneath the cottonwood out back, Olive asleep in her lap. The child had grown heavier, her limbs more certain. Georgia watched the trees shift above her, the wind combing through their branches, and thought about how quiet no longer meant loneliness. Orin approached from the shed, wiping his hands on a strip of canvas. "Fence is holding," he said. "That north post won't last another season, but it'll keep for now." "I never thought I'd care about a fence," she said, brushing a curl from Olive's forehead. "But I check it every morning like it's part of me now." He crouched beside them, his eyes on the baby. "That's how it starts." She tilted her head. "What does?" "Belonging." Georgia studied his face. "You ever think about leaving this place?" He shook his head once. "I already did my wandering. Came back with half a leg that won't ever be right and no kin to speak for me. This land's what I chose. And now you." Olive stirred, her fingers curling into Georgia's shawl. Georgia adjusted the wrap to keep the child shaded, then looked back at him. "I still wake some nights thinking I'm in that burned-out cabin," she said. "Then I hear the wind through this door and I remember I'm not." "You don't have to forget it," he said, "but it doesn't get to decide who you are here." She met his eyes. "What am I here?" He didn't answer with words. He reached up and traced the edge of her jaw with the back of his knuckles, slow and sure, as though the question had already been answered. That evening, while Olive slept in the cradle inside, Georgia stepped out onto the porch. Orin stood near the hitching post, oiling the leather of his saddle. The sun had dipped, and the sky behind him was streaked with rose and ash. "You never told me what brought you back after the war," she said. He didn't look up from the saddle. "I buried Leeser right over there. Took me half the day to dig through the frozen ground. I didn't have anywhere else to go after that. And now," he straightened, "now I've got 2 people who need me, and for the first time I'm not afraid of being needed." She stepped closer. Why not? Because you don't ask for anything I can't give. She placed her hand over his. You've given more than most men ever would. He turned his palm to catch hers. You gave me back a reason to wake up. They stood there while the last of the light disappeared. Then Georgia leaned in and kissed him slow, unhurried, a promise rather than a question. His hand settled at her waist, solid and warm. Inside, Olive stirred but didn't cry. The world had quieted. A week later they stood before Reverend Howley beneath the cottonwood, Orin in his cleanest shirt, Georgia in a dress made from flour sacks stitched over with faint blue thread. Olive wore a bonnet too big for her head and blinked at the gathered neighbors, most of whom they barely knew. A cowhand from the Bayard ranch played a hymn on a battered fiddle, and the widow brought a jar of honey as a gift. Orin said few words, but he held Georgia's hands with care. Georgia didn't cry, though her voice caught once when she promised not to run, not from him, not from this life. Olive reached for Orin's coat button during the blessing, and he let her pull it loose. They ate bread and beans by the fire that night, the cradle between them. Georgia laid her head on his shoulder, and he kissed her hair. I used to believe peace was something you earned after everything else, she said. And now I know it's something you build together. He pulled the quilt higher around her. Then let's keep building. Years passed, but the cabin stood. The garden grew wide. A second cradle was carved, and then a third, each one shaped with the same careful hands. Georgia taught Olive to read by lamplight, and Orin took her riding along the stream bed once her legs were strong enough to hold. He never raised his voice in the house, and she never left without telling him when she'd be back. When the roof leaked again 2 springs later, they mended it together. The north post eventually gave way, but they replaced it side by side. They grew older, as people do, but their hands never stopped reaching for one another. And the land around them, once wild and uncertain, became something steady like breath, like soil, like love that had been waited for and at last found.